Hello, everyone. I'm Ione Butler, and I'm excited to introduce you to today's guest, Jackson McKenzie. Jackson, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Thank you. And I'm really interested in about having this conversation because I was thinking about it. It's not necessarily uplifting, which is what the Uplifting Content podcast is all about. But I think that when being able to understand these types of toxic relationships and what we're about to talk to today and how to get over them can be incredibly uplifting for people. So the title topic for this episode is Let's Talk About How to Heal After Toxic Relationships and Emotional Abuse. And Jackson, I would love for you to just share a little bit about your story and how you started doing the work that you do, please.
Sure. So I think the relationship that I wrote my first book about was it was around 7 years ago, and it was as described, just a toxic relationship. There were kind of the telltale patterns of the idolization period, where the person mirrors your personality and says that you're their soulmate and exactly like what everything that they want, their hopes, dreams, insecurities. Kind of like the 24/7 communication and just really, really quick, really, really fast. And that was actually my first relationship. And then as those relationships tend to do, it started to devolve into more of like the insults and the looping exes back into the picture and kind of dangling other people in front of you and attempting to provoke jealousy and rivalries and all of that. And there's just a lot of the accusations and the idea being that anytime you point those things out, you get called crazy. There's something wrong with you.
How quickly after this initial like all about you phase did it start? Did you start to notice that?
It's interesting. There are, I think, earlier hints that maybe I brushed aside, which is an issue in and of itself. But little criticisms that you really wouldn't get from a loving partner. I think partners will joke around and say silly things to each other, but when someone is just blatantly criticizing the way you look or your friendships or your family or things like that, those are not really healthy things in a relationship. And then I would say once you get past the love you phase and everyone's feels secure in the relationship is when the nastiness really starts to kick in. So probably like several months, like 3 or 4 months.
Okay, and then what happened?
It was a really confusing time in my life, and I actually blamed myself at the time. I listened to what was being said to me, that there was something wrong with me and that I was seeing things that weren't there. And then when the relationship ended, all of those things ended up being true, and I was angry and I was hurt and confused. And I did my best to kind of do the no contact thing, so to move on my own. And he continued to kind of reach out to try to create more drama. And and that really was where I just became so confused and frustrated and started looking around to like why a relationship would ever be like this and why people would intentionally cheat on each other and like blame the other person for it and wave that person in your face. It just didn't seem normal to me, even by cheating standards. So and that was when I came across narcissism and sociopaths and psychopaths.
Right, and I want to kind of speak to you in more detail about that, but just back to your story. So how long did this relationship last in total?
It was just about a year.
Okay.
Yeah.
And for you, because I have a couple of friends who have just got out of quite toxic relationships, and one of them found it very difficult. And so a year doesn't seem like too long based on my friend's experience. And so I'm curious to know, like, was it easy for you? Because I know for some people it can be very difficult to break out of these relationships. How was your experience about getting out? Was it challenging?
Yeah, there are a lot of times where you tell yourself that the relationship is not good and it should end, and then doubt yourself and apologize, and you sort of come across as like swinging back and forth, because at one point you're mad and trying to stick up for yourself, and then you get maybe the silent treatment or something for doing that to kind of teach you not to do that again. And then you start to doubt and blame yourself again, and kind of go right back into that same situation. So it was definitely difficult. I think once the more anger stuff started kicking in and it became more clear what had actually happened, there wasn't any desire to go back there.
And it's interesting because what I've heard from people that are in these situations, it's interesting what you said about like that whole beginning phase when they're just all about you and everything's amazing. Because a lot of the times my friends will speak back to the time when it was so great. And I'm like, yeah, but now as you're saying this, I'm like, but that's all part of it, right? To kind of pretend that it's great. But the reality of it is that most of the time it's not that, I'm sure.
Exactly. And it's hard because you're hanging on to the hopes that it'll go back to the way it was, where you feel like you found the perfect person and there would never be anyone like that again. And reconciling that with this other side of them that seems to be coming out more and more, like the gaslighting and manipulation and lying.
So I want to talk about those things too. So can you just tell me about like what's the difference or the meanings of sort of psychopath, narcissist, and what was the other word you used?
Sociopath.
Like, can you just tell us a bit about how those types of people behave?
Yeah, sure. And I'm not a clinical psychologist or anything like that. This is really just based on the different works that I've come across on the topic by the professionals. But they're all in the cluster B spectrum of disorders. So psychological disorders. The cluster B ones have to do primarily with emotional drama attachment issues. And their relationships, whether it's narcissist, sociopath, borderline, histrionic, they always tend to follow that very similar pattern, the idolize, devalue, discard thing. And I think what you'll find with narcissism is there's a really intense need for attention, and they want you to be adoring of them and to think that they're the best person in the world. And they kind of feed off of that attention, getting all of that praise. And so they may give it to you at first, so you give it back, and then they have what they want there, which is to kind of get that constant feedback. The problem is if you're attaching that quickly to someone, you detach just as quickly, and you tend to then go look for more attention from someone else. There's kind of an intense boredom that most narcissists tend to describe. And sociopaths also follow similar relationship patterns. I think where sociopaths and psychopaths start to branch off a little is you'll see there's almost some like intention and enjoyment out of harming other people, and maybe more of like a more well thought out reason for entering the relationship, and how can I exploit this person and what can I get out of it, and maybe that it'll be really satisfying to watch this previously happy person be really confused and hurt. And so that's almost a little bit more sadistic. And then the last one would fall on borderline, which instead of attention, a lot that's there too, but you'll see a strong need for sympathy, to be seen as like the victim. And often they attract rescuers who are like, oh, I'm not going to hurt you like all of your crazy abusive exes. And they treat you like the knight in shining armor until they turn on you.
And that's borderline what, sorry?
Borderline personality disorder.
Gotcha. Thank you for that. So you started psychopath free, which I've realized is for some reason I can't get my mouth around those words together. Psychopathfree.com is anyway. And so that was that shortly after your relationship?
Yeah, I think I made some friends along the way, like in random Facebook groups, and I'd come up with the idea and the name, and I have like kind of a computer science background, and I thought, oh, we could put together a website for this, because we found that a lot of us had the same challenges and pain that we were working through, and a similar healing process. So we built that forum in the community for people to come on, along with articles, and then the book just kind of came out from there, because you end up realizing that a lot of people have a very, very similar, almost universal relationship cycle and path to healing. So wanted to make sure we got that out there.
And it's done. It's done really well, right? The blog, obviously, and the forum and the website took off. I think there's like a need for people to have, when you're in this kind of experience, having someone to relate to and talk to. And so, how has that been for you? Just kind of seeing how that's benefited people.
Yeah, it was definitely surprising. I think it grew faster than we were really able to super keep up with. And over the years, we've kind of come up with more ways to ensure that it just doesn't like blow up too quickly. At one point, we were getting like 1,000 posts a day, and that's just for like 3 people or 4 or 5 people, however, where our moderator base was at the time, to be trying to go through all those in addition to like our day jobs. It was just actually kind of consuming, and a little bit negative, but we were also really glad that it was helping the majority of the people. And that's what we tried to focus on.
It's interesting because it's sad that there's such a need for it, but it's amazing that it exists to help people. And as you're saying that, I'm like, hang on a second, would there be psychopaths and narcissists and people like that on there too, do you reckon? Did you come across that much?
Yeah, we came across some really interesting personalities. I think more than your average forum would, just because it tended to turn up in a lot of search results, and our Facebook page would link to it. So yeah, that would happen.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. And what was your day job before? And do you still do things outside of this arena? Or?
Oh yeah, I have my regular day job. I work in technology, doing like project management and systems analyst work, and I really like it. I think it's always good to take a nice long break from psychopath stuff, and it's like not the most cheerful topic ever. So I really like my job, and I love my coworkers too. And then the writing on the side has just always been a really fun passion to have.
Great. So we're also, I'd love to talk about your new book, Whole Again, which is about how to overcome and heal from toxic and abusive relationships. And so you've got 2 books. You did Psychopath Free and Whole Again. And Jackson has kindly offered to give away some copies of his book. And so we'll run that contest for a month, and we'll have links for you to sign up to enter to win. And we'll also have links that you can get his book now. So you can go and buy it for yourself, or maybe as a gift for someone that you think might need it, and then win one for whatever. Just some suggestions. So one of the things that I'm always curious about is I sometimes seem to think, like, I don't know how people can fall into these traps. But then saying that, there has been times where I definitely think I was prey of a narcissist who was somebody I worked with, and I was not interested in him at all. But then he just, was messaging me all the time, is very sweet, like really nice to me. And I kind of found myself becoming really attracted and interested in him. And then I realized that he was kind of seeing and having these kind of things with lots of women at work. And some of them were just like really into him. And I don't think he ever did the kind of nasty stuff for me. He did back off eventually, but I know he was definitely doing it with other people. And it was just kind of like, oh, it can really easily happen to people. And so do you have any tips and advice on like what to look out for and be mindful for when people are like that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really common thing where you find out that they're basically saying all the same stuff to you, to everyone else. And you go from feeling like special or like, oh, maybe we could give this a chance or something like that, to being like, oh, this is like just like replaceable. That's pretty weird. But I think being able to identify those red flags, I think you'll find that like most people don't move that quickly at the beginning of a relationship or even a dating period. Like if someone's really into, they'll flirt, they'll be friendly and all that stuff, but they tend to honor and the boundaries of rejection. They understand if someone's not interested in them and back off. They aren't just like showering you with flattery and affection and praise when they barely even know you. Those are the kinds of things that I think are initially a little bit more on the, now looking back, a little bit more on the creepy and also like impersonal side, because you don't know someone well enough to really be fascinated by them on every level like that. And those kinds of quick infatuations are usually like a pretty unhealthy way to start a relationship.
Gotcha. And so moving through to people that are, do you have any advice or recommendations for people who are trying to get out or break this cycle? Because it seems like you quickly saw what was going on, but I know for some people it's very difficult to kind of let go and move away. And how have you felt? What are ways that people have been able to break through?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it can be really complicated, especially when like marriage or kids are involved or something like that. And so the traditional advice of just go no contact is sometimes really not applicable there. The biggest recommendation that I would have is sometimes we get focused on the other person. So identifying their behaviors, trying to change them, trying to understand why they're doing what they're doing. And I really these days recommend shifting the focus internally to ourselves. to identify a lot of what's going on there, whether it be self-doubt or guilt or anxiety or dread anytime a conflict comes up, or this feeling like maybe, you're not going to be enough, or you're going to be inadequate without this person. Those kinds of sensations are really important to work with. We tend to feel them in like the body and the mind. And I think the more we work with those and the more we start to understand ourselves, the more we start to build a better relationship with who we are, and actually come to care about that person that we are. And that's sort of like the birth of self-respect, when you start feeling things like anger and that's not right, or that's not fair, and I deserve better, and those kinds of things. And that really would be my first step, is that instead of really focusing too much on the other person, find new ways to learn to love yourself and take care of yourself. I've found almost every time people start down that path, it may take a little while, but a relationship with a toxic person is just not going to work if you like yourself enough. And because you are going to continually butt heads. They work with toxic people when you cave to their demands, when you try to avoid the conflicts, when you try to say, yes, you're right, I'm sorry, you're always right. And those are the kinds of personalities that tend to mesh well with those relationships. When you lose that, they tend to also become very frustrated.
Oh, I see. So when the partner starts to gain more self-respect and say no to things, and the toxic person is sort of loses interest a little bit, kind of what you're saying.
Yeah, and they may even provoke them at first to try harder, to try to get you back into their control or whatever. But I think, unless if you're being like physically harmed, I would recommend immediately like seeking out professional help from a shelter. But with the emotional manipulation and those kinds of things, I really think that gaining that self-respect, you're more and more going to start to find that the solution and your path forward is really clear.
Gotcha. And now, sort of moving into your books and the new one especially, can you sort of share a little bit about what that healing process is about? Because you talk about like a sort of a relational PTSD from these relationships, which I'd actually never even thought of before. But yes, like being in a toxic relationship for 8 years I'm sure it does do stuff to people. So can you talk a bit about that and kind of what you advise to sort of helping people heal from that experience?
Yeah, definitely. I think at first there's that stage that almost everyone goes through, where they kind of learn about those relationship cycles and realize that they're not alone, and that those kinds of behaviors are actually a lot more common than maybe they would have thought. And that tends to bring about a lot of anger and confusion and back and forth, like where they really need validation to realize that what they went through is not right, and that this isn't how normal humans treat each other. And so that phase, I think, is huge. And that's a lot of what Psychopath Free was, and still is just getting people to that point where they're like, oh, no, this isn't right. Something is up. Where Whole Again kind of branches off is that, again, the focus is all internally. There is some mention of the personality disorders there, but really what I look for in the long-term healing, especially if someone describes any sort of PTSD, and that can really be identified with like tension or numbness in the body, heaviness, these things. A lot of times you'll hear people say, I miss my old self. I feel like I'm a different person from before the relationship and after. And there could be like depression and anxiety and paranoia in future relationships, not knowing if you can trust yourself. That self-doubt is huge because you've had someone telling you that you can't trust yourself or that you're crazy. And, you could tell yourself a million times over it was the other person, something was up with them, but there's still that lingering blech that kind of sits under the surface. And so that's really what I'm trying to help people to fully identify and feel, so that it can be let go, so we can move forward in our lives, whether it be on our own, seeking out another relationship in a much healthier way. To do those, it's just letting go of those underlying wounds can be really difficult.
And what are the ways that you sort of suggest people work through them? I think one of them is like identifying stuff, right? And is this things that people do on their own, or do a lot of people get therapy for? Do you coach people or anything like that? Or is it?
I don't do any coaching, just because I figured with my background, a computer scientist probably has limits in what they can offer.
Well, I think you're pretty well experienced in it now, but that's fair enough.
Yeah. But I do, I really did talk with a lot of, thousands of people with Psychopath Free. And then before this book, I really got an idea of like what these people were dealing with. And I think it can be really hard because when we're carrying emotional pain and baggage and heaviness, sometimes our minds go into overdrive almost in a way to protect us, to
Yeah.
keep us away from that pain. And it's where you'll see people like become a workaholic or, work on a million different accomplishments or turn to like drugs and alcohol. These are all things that if someone were to look at their life, they may be able to kind of quickly identify, like I do tend to maybe distract or dissociate from something deeper underlying, which a lot of times by that point is all numbed out.
Hmm.
But they can still tell that something isn't right. So the first step that I encourage readers to look through in that book is how maybe they've been distracted since that relationship. And to be honest, that can really include talking or thinking about the relationship 24/7, even like years after it's over or months after it's over. It's not that you ever want to invalidate someone or say that they shouldn't still think about it or process it. But at some point, it's also important to recognize that the person is gone. They're no longer in the picture. And so anything that's happening now is actually, it's being caused and perpetuated by the self, by our own brain and body.
Hmm.
And that can be a really confusing and frustrating thing to realize because it's like, no, like it's because of what that person did that I feel this way. But again, if the person isn't in the picture, then it's sort of up to us to realize that we're the only ones who can start to move past that.
Hmm.
But that's also, I think, a really like exciting thing to realize because it's that thing where maybe that problem was caused, but we also have the ability to fix it.
Right. So I'm just a little bit confused. So if you're saying that, like that makes sense. You don't want somebody to be sort of constantly in their mind, but then there's also if they're not processing it and they're distracting themselves by working or doing other things, and how do they heal from that trauma without thinking about the situation or what happened?
Yeah, yeah. And I think in a traditional relationship, getting past a breakup involves that regular, like feeling bad, crying, working through the emotions and moving on. The problem with trauma is that you'll actually see that it lingers so
Mm.
far after it, and you'll see this rumination over and over and over again about what happened. And most trauma survivors will tell you that they can repeat their story in like perfect detail, step by step, but for some reason something still doesn't feel or sit right. And so the idea would never be to just like pretend like the trauma isn't there, but it's
Mm.
about, at least what I found that really helped a lot of people is slowing down from those distractions and focusing really on what's going on in our bodies. And so that's a lot of like mind body mindfulness.
Mhm.
Um, is like, do we feel some sort of like strange tightness or hurt in our stomach, in our chest, in our core, just those kinds of things that linger, which is really what trauma does is it stays there even when maybe the event is long over. And
Mhm.
really what it's trying to do is protect that thing from happening again. But in order to protect you from it, trauma hangs on to that pain and it hangs on to the wound. So it's sort of like if if maybe if someone like cut their hand, that they just keep cutting their hand every day to remind themselves not to cut their hand, and it
Mm.
creates this really bad feedback loop where the person always feels uncomfortable and agitated, and really unable to relax and kind of enjoy life a little bit more freely.
So it's just being able to, when the time is right, being able to process that, the pain, the feelings, the emotions associated with it, which I guess is probably a terrifying prospect for some people, but just to let go of the trauma and trauma and to heal, you've got to kind of work through that at some point.
Yeah, and to hear its messages and really, like you said, to experience them, not distract from them. So
Mm.
we tend to only distract ourselves when there's something really painful underneath. Otherwise, I don't think the body would bother with setting up all of those protective measures. And I think with toxic relationships, especially the cluster B ones that we've talked about, um, you'll really commonly find that people are dealing with these tremendous feelings of rejection or inadequacy or betrayal or abandonment. And those things underlying, no matter how much you identify that the other person was wrong or bad, that doesn't make the feeling of rejection or betrayal or abandonment go away. And so when we can kind of let ourselves into that hurt, and it's like, it's a world of pain. It's that it's called toxic shame. And, guilt is like, oh, I did something bad. I shouldn't have done that. I'm going to rectify it. Shame is more like, I am bad and I'm a bad person for having done that. And toxic shame is when that sense of I am bad becomes like a core pervasive sense of self. It's who you are. It's like, maybe that person left you because you're not enough and other people are better than you, and you are inadequate. You are you are unlovable. You are not wanted. And for a lot of people, the relationship is not the first time they felt that. They may have had a parent who rejected them, or a parent who abandoned early on. There could have been like trusted caregivers. A lot of times people who end up in these relationships come from very high conflict households, where they're always used to trying to manage everyone else's emotions, to predict what's going to happen so they can prevent it from escalating. And those are all the kinds of things that keep us focused externally and on other people, when there's usually something going on inside that really needs our help.
So are you saying that for someone that experiences toxic shame like that, it's for them to first of all realize that that's what they're doing? They're telling themselves that, but then how do they change their beliefs about themselves?
So I think there's a lot of different paths to healing there. The mentality that I've adopted, which I don't know if everyone would agree with this, I've had a lot of success with people in the book who are trying it out, is that it's really hard to like heal toxic shame and comfort it, or because there are a lot of really nice healing methods where you learn like nice self-talk, like, oh, you're not bad, or you're not rejectable, or you are enough. And I think those things are really important, and being able to communicate with ourselves like that is hugely important. The challenge with toxic shame, though, is that it sticks like sludge, convinces you that it's the truth and that you have to listen to it. And if you're not listening to it, you're just kind of lying to yourself. And that is really where I encourage people to experiment with unidentifying with it. A lot of mindfulness approaches list the same thing. So it's the non-identification with the feeling. You're recognizing, as Tara Brach says, you recognize that it's real, but not necessarily true. So you look and you feel that rejection, or, oh, you're crazy, or you're bad. And you say, okay, that's interesting. And just slowly start experimenting with not identifying with it. So you see it there, but you just think, maybe that's not who I am. And I found with a lot of people that they start to feel the tension and the discomfort in their body just dissolves away. And with that, there's just a tremendous wave of lightness that probably has escaped them for a very long time.
I talk a lot about one of the most powerful books for me is The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle. And it was the first book that really made me realize how much my thoughts were affecting me with depression and all sorts of other things. And my self-talk, it was that I was so identified with the thinking, you're a failure, no one's ever going to love you, you're going to die alone, you're a terrible actress, you're never going to make it, you're never amount to, and I believed them to be true. And as soon as I realized that those thoughts and what I was thinking wasn't true, they were just thoughts and I could change them, I was free. And so it's just that realization that we believe everything in the mind and that voice in our head to be true. And as soon as you go, oh, actually it's not. And I'm the one that can control these things and what I'm thinking and then as soon as I started to do that, I would just flip everything that I was saying that was horrible about myself. I hate myself. I hate myself. I hate myself. Do I love myself? I love myself. And it was so awkward and difficult in the beginning. But eventually I just started to believe it. And I say to people, if you can train yourself to think horrible things about yourself, you can train yourself to do the opposite. And
one of those ends up feeling a lot better. So it eventually just becomes a logical decision. You're like, well, if I can train myself to think bad or good, and one of them feels like garbage, then maybe we'll go with the other.
How's about that for an idea? Yeah, exactly. It does.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. That's great.
I'm curious to hear how it's been with you in relationships since then. Have you come up against any sort of toxic people since, or have you found it difficult being in relation, like any nervousness around new relationships? How's that been?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm in a relationship now, and he's a wonderful human being. Probably like the
Glad he's not a psychopath.
yeah, like the kindest person on the planet.
Amazing.
And but it does take some time to adjust. I think sometimes where if a conflict comes up, and you're used to expecting that it's going to blow up into something horrible. It just takes a little bit of time to realize, like, oh, this person's actually trying to diffuse it just like you, and to understand your perspective, and they want to like apologize, or they want to talk about it like adults. And that's actually, I think it's a fantastic experience, because we can't just like make our past disappear, but we can start to readjust the story, and learn from the past, and realize that there are a lot of really wonderful people out there too.
That's beautiful. And I do keep feeling that for friends and people that have left abusive relationships, just to think, like, I know it's really difficult now, but I just can't wait to see you with someone who amplifies you and supports you and doesn't make you feel like you're worthless and all that type of stuff. And I'm glad that you found a lovely partner. Thank you for your time today and sharing this. I just think that the work you're doing is so powerful and necessary, and I'm sure you've helped the lives of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. So thank you, and for sharing some of this today as well.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great talking with you.
Yes, yeah, you too. And just as a reminder, everyone, we're giving away copies of Jackson's book, Whole Again. We also have the links to his 2 books in the show notes, and all the information about him and his website, Psychopath Free. I said it for the first time.
You got it.
We'll have all those links in the show notes. So thanks again, Jackson. Bye,
Thank
everyone. You.